Ordering a no-fly zone over Ukraine will therefore dramatically escalate the chances of a hot war between Russia and Belarus on one side and the United States and NATO on the other. And when you consider that NATO vastly overpowers Russia in nearly every single category of military capabilities except for nuclear, it's not inconceivable that if the Kremlin felt they were being backed too far into a corner, they might choose to authorize a smaller-scale tactical nuclear strike somewhere in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. And it's impossible to predict how things could hypothetically escalate from there. But it's not just the enormous risk of escalation towards a third world war in Europe that makes the no-fly zone unfeasible. Even if one were to be declared, it's unclear how helpful it would actually be. Many of the Russian airstrikes that have hit targets across Ukraine have been missiles fired from planes flying within Russian airspace that never left or entered Ukrainian airspace, which a no-fly zone over Ukraine would not protect against. And that's besides the point that the overwhelming, vast majority of the damage that the Russian military has been inflicting on Ukraine has come from ground-based artillery and missile attacks, which, again, a no-fly zone on its own would not be designed to prevent. Back in the 1990s, when NATO imposed a no-fly zone over Bosnia, it initially did very little to prevent Serb forces on the ground from carrying out highly destructive artillery strikes, and thus, a frustrated and pressured NATO gradually expanded the scope of their aerial operation towards bombing Serb targets on the ground. This exact situation could end up playing out in Ukraine as well against ground-based Russian artillery and missile systems, and thus NATO could find itself dangerously expanding the scope of the operation very quickly. And finally, unlike the Serbs or Saddam or Gaddafi, the Russians also possess a very capable and powerful navy with highly capable long-range strike abilities. Back in 2015, a flotilla of Russian warships operating within the Caspian Sea fired 26 cruise missiles towards Islamic State targets across Syria more than 1,000 kilometers away. Hypothetically, these same ships operating within either the Caspian or the Black Sea could initiate cruise missile strikes into Ukraine from hundreds of kilometers outside of the boundaries of any hypothetical no-fly zone, which could lead to a situation where, once again, NATO may have to consider attacking Russian naval assets outside of the parameters of the no-fly zone in order to fully prevent attacks coming from the sky, and dramatically risk escalating to the brink of nuclear war. So, with all of this being said, a no-fly zone over Ukraine would offer only limited help to Ukrainian forces on the ground, while dramatically increasing the risks of apocalyptic military confrontation between NATO and Russia. And so, that's generally why Biden and the majority of NATO have decided that it simply isn't worth the risk, and are unlikely to change their minds. But there are other potential methods that NATO can employ to help Ukraine defend their skies. Earlier in March, Poland, a NATO ally directly bordering Ukraine, offered to transfer 28 of their older Soviet-era MiG fighter jets to the United States and Germany, who would then hopefully transfer them over to the Ukrainian Air Force and replenish the Polish Air Force with a set of newer F-16 fighter jets. However, this too is something that the United States eventually declined to do, out of fear of risking further escalation with Moscow. But there are other things that America has done to support the Ukrainian war effort a bit more indirectly. Following President Zelensky's emotional speech to the United States Congress, Washington announced a further $800 million security package for Ukraine, which will further add to the plentiful anti-air and anti-tank weapons that have already been provided, including around 800 Stinger shoulder-fired anti-air launchers. Simultaneously, Turkey, another NATO ally, has already sold several dozen of their very capable aerial drones to the Ukrainian military as well. Regardless of what kind of help is given by the governments of NATO, the civilians and children that are there on the ground and suffering right now are in dire, absolute need of some kind of help from someone. It's estimated that there are at least 7.5 million Ukrainian children who are now in grave danger of physical harm, severe emotional trauma, and displacement. And while NATO will not be ordering a no-fly zone,